got no more questions on that. I'm going to go ahead and start on 16. I promise this one is much shorter. Okay, so chapter 16, implementing switch security. And actually a lot of these security features we're going to go over are either exactly the same or very similar to what we discussed previously with router security several chapters back. So first step of switch security is securing physical access to the switch. There's a false sense of security because switches are LAN devices, that they're safe from hacks. You know, you've got a router in front of them to protect them from that kind of thing. But your most likely attackers for any switch network are the employees that are connecting directly to it. So you got to make sure you've got some kind of security in place for that. First thing to do is make sure that you keep that in a locked room that is cool. You don't want to, it's an electronic device. You don't want it getting too hot, so it does have to be an air-conditioned room, preferably, but locked and basically kept away from anyone that doesn't have access to it. Otherwise, anyone with physical access to a switch can easily console in and try to perform a password recovery, or simply power off or destroy the equipment. Maybe if you don't have it set in the correct space, a janitor comes into vacuum, accidentally unplugs it, plugs in a vacuum, and as a result you have a major problem. So securing access to the switch is for routers and switches, actually first line of defense is physical access. So and then securing terminal access to the switch. We definitely talked about this with routers. You want to make sure your console and auxiliary ports have passwords set to them, so that no one can just immediately get in. So configuration from global configuration mode, line console 0 jumps you into line configuration mode, and you can either do a login local, where it's going to use whatever the local credentials are on the router, or you can set a specific password for the console port. In this case, we set a specific password. So login is one line, and then a separate line of password, and then whatever you want your password to be. And then exit out of there, line auxiliary 0 jumps you into line configuration for that, and same thing, login and then password and whatever you want your password to be. Another important option is SSH security, basically whether you choose to use Telnet or SSH. We've talked about this a bunch of times too. SSH is way more secure and should be used over Telnet whenever possible, because it's sent as encrypted instead of plain text. 4 steps for doing that. 1, you've got to change the default host name of your equipment. 2, you've got to configure an IP domain name with the IP space domain -name command. 3rd, you got to generate the RSA key with the crypto key generate. And again, recommended to at least set that to 1024 bytes to make sure that you got good encryption, good strong encryption no one can crack. And then create a username and password as your last step. You can also set up an ACL to only allow SSH from certain IPs. We'll talk about that a lot more when we get to chapter 19, on setting up ACLs and how we can set those to prevent unauthorized SSH and Telnet access. And then you can also take the additional step of setting SSH as the only VTY transport method. So from VTY, line VTY 0, and then however many VTY sessions you have. In this case on the switch you can have up to 15, so 0 through 15. I guess that's 16 total actually. Login local, so this one I didn't set specifically to VTY, I just used the local creds. And then the important part on here is transport input SSH. If you don't include Telnet or HTTP, HTTPS in that transport input methods, SSH is basically your only option for actually accessing it, at least via a remote terminal. And then some additional iOS security practices. Encrypt the enable password using the enable secret command instead of the enable password command. Encrypt all clear text passwords through the config with the service password -encryption command. And again, pretty much all these came up when we talked about the routers security stuff. Create a login banner that warns against unauthorized access. Don't ever use the word welcome or come on in your login banner. Disable exec access on all unused terminal access ports, such as aux, with the no exec command. So if you know for sure no one's ever going to try to get in through aux, and there's no reason you're going to need to get in through aux, you might as well disable access on that. And then limit the exec timeout on terminal sessions. Default is 10 minutes. Most system administrators want to reduce that. The exec, from line configuration mode, the exec dash timeout, and then your time period in hours, minutes and seconds, or excuse me, just minutes and seconds. Should help reduce that below 10 minutes so that you can get something a little bit more reasonable, 2 to 5 minutes. And then layer 2 port security, to prevent users from connecting to a hub, to a switch port. You can statically limit the number of MAC addresses assigned to a port and set a security policy if this is violated. So basically, let's assume that for some reason you've got a user that connects a hub to a switch port instead of just their PC. They could connect any number of devices behind that, but the switch is going to see that there are multiple MAC addresses assigned to that switch port, because everything that comes in from the hub, every MAC address that comes through that hub into that switch port, it's going to see the MAC address and add it to the CAM table. What this does is it sets a maximum number of MAC entries that can be assigned to a switch port, and it also sets a policy to enact if a violation occurs to that. So first command is switch port port-security, which basically turns on port security, and then switch port-security maximum, and then 8. This is a bit high. I probably would set that to 2, because in most situations, at most you're going to want 2 devices, potentially an IP phone and the actual PC that connects behind it. And then keep in mind this is all under interface configuration mode, so this is on a per port basis. And then switch port-security, violation, and then you've got an option of protect, restrict, and shut down. Shutdown is pretty straightforward. It places the port into an error-disabled state, and it can't basically be used again until an administrator logs into the switch and does a no-shut on that port. You also have an option for restrict, which restrict increases a violation counter, so basically counts each time like it violates, or it can also send an alert to an administrator via SNMP that a restriction has taken place. And then you can also set it to protect, which will basically drop traffic from excess MAC addresses until it goes back to below whatever the maximum you set was.
What's the difference between just doing a regular shut from just a config IF # just shut down versus switch port security violation?
Well, shutdown is just going to so this is something that automatically happens in the event that a violation occurs. Shutdown, if you just did a shutdown, like, it's going to shut the port and no one's ever going to be able to use it. So you don't know if it's a proper user using it or.
So if there is a violation.
Yeah, exactly. This is basically saying that it's enabling port security, setting a port security policy, and then setting an option of what happens if that port security violation occurs. So these are your 3 options for what action to take in the event that the violation does occur.
So basically, like if someone disconnects the add tran and then plugs in their laptop to that port, it'll shut it down automatically because it has a different MAC address.
Well, it depends on what you set the policy, but
like
if you set the maximum to 1, someone disconnected their PC and hooked up a laptop, it would, if you set it to shut down the port, and they wouldn't be able to use it until an administrator came in.
How long do you reboot the action? Does it save that to the config file, or
does it save the shutdown port?
I don't know. If you reboot it, I would think that it would come up correctly after a reboot. I'm not sure if the port security counters are just held in there statically afterward. I'm pretty sure that if you rebooted it, the port would be available again without having to do a no-shut.
So basically, you put your laptop on there, you push it down, and reboot it, and now you're the only MAC address on there.
Right. I don't know for sure that that's the case. I mean, if it's doing an actual shutdown, depending on how the logic is working out in the Cisco, like, it may actually be applying a shutdown command, in which case, like, if you did a reboot, as long as it saved it to memory, you would have to unshut. I don't actually know the answer to that after a reboot, if it holds it or not.